good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our weekly True Africa University, MIT Africa, MIT Center for International Studies webinar on sustainable development in Africa. It is my pleasure to welcome you again this week. I want to apologize because we had to change the schedule at the last minute. We were supposed to be in conversation with Obi Ezekwesili today, but she had to travel, so we moved her session to next week. Instead, we are very, very fortunate to have next week's speaker step in this week, and our speaker is Kenfield Griffith. So Kenfield is a very dear friend, and he is also a product of MIT in the very, very best way. How should I put it? He's solving a really big problem, actually, and this is a problem of data in Africa. Sometimes people forget that Africa is just so scarce with respect to actual data, and we often have a hard time just accessing data, which would actually lead to development. If you look at, say, the Sustainable Development Goals, which inform this webinar series, only 20% of that data is actually available in Africa. I'll just give you a few more data points. This really affects people, it affects governments, it affects kind of development initiatives. All kinds of researchers and businesses are trying to tackle this problem. But Kenfield has been doing this ever since he graduated from MIT with his PhD in design and computation and system design in 2012. So for more than a decade, he has really focused on this issue of data collection and data for development as a serial entrepreneur. He was a founder of M-Survey. He was a founder of Ajwa, which is building CX management for financial services for mobile operators in Africa, as well as large retail within a rapidly growing payment ecosystem in Africa. But now his newest company, which he co-founded and leads as CEO, is called Tappi. And Tappi is building the tools to help small and medium businesses with their online identity in order to find customers online. Now, this is really important because in this kind of data scarcity environment, people like Kenfield, who really understand how to work data, can actually step in and make a real difference. So this is very much geared towards the MIT community. I know you guys and we guys spend a lot of time thinking about this. So without further ado, I want to welcome Kenfield Griffith, who's the CEO and co-founder of Tappi.
Claude, great to be here. Happy to be here with everyone. Let me just actually share my screen quickly, and then I can just begin. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome.
Loud and clear.
Awesome, great. So there we go. So thank you, Claude. I'm really excited to be here with everyone, True Africa University, CIS, and MIT community, and just the audience to discuss the topic that I'm really, really passionate about, and that is actually how can Africa leverage its data for growth. My name is Kenfield Griffith. I got my PhD at MIT. I'm the co-founder, CEO and co-founder of Tappi. And Tappi is really trying to leverage data to give the over 40 million SMEs or small businesses across Africa access to the $180 billion internet economy and help them find customers online to grow their business. So we're really focusing on leveraging that data, but I'll discuss it a bit more as we go through, how I came about this and how, data can be used to leverage growth across the continent. So you're going to hear me talk about these three things, right? So I want to make sure we aligned and define these terms. Africa, in my context, in the world that I live in and the world I operate in, I think of two things, the two players, businesses and consumers. So when you hear me talk about Africa, I'll be talking about business and consumers. And then also when you think about data, the three types of data I talk about is first-party data. So it's data you collect, you own that data. And the second-party data is data your partner collects. So for instance, if you partner with someone and they have data, you can kind of merge that data with your data. And then third-party data, which is open and accessible data. So a good representation of that would be census data, right? So you're going to hear me talk about that a lot. And then last but not least is the term growth, right? Growth could mean anything, right? So in this context of this talk, I want to talk about economic drivers of growth, and more so to drive economic prosperity. So as we dive in, I want to make this a little bit interactive, and I want to just ask, and I think everyone can comment in the Q&A section is, in this image, what do you see? Right, I'll give about 45 seconds for someone, folks to comment in the Q&A box, and we can actually continue. But I'm going to wait until I get a comment. So what do you see in this image? And it could be anything. Great. So I'm getting, people, I'm getting Lagos, Nigeria, where I live, a day at the market, potential customers, huge market, right? All of these are right? And if you think about this in the context of Africa, this is what data looks like to me, right? And this is what data looks like to, from my perspective. But I want to even just zoom in a bit more, right? So if I actually zoom in a bit more, I'm actually pointing out, I think it's 4 or 5 different, 4 people in this image. And all of them, guess what do they have? They have a mobile phone. And that's just the mobile phones you can see. And there are probably many more mobile phones that you can't see, right? So if you think about this image, you're seeing people, you're seeing customers, you're seeing a huge market, you're seeing Lagos. There's a lot of activity, a lot of things going on. And then if you zoom in more, you see these individuals with mobile phones. So the reason I bring that up and point that out, because that's the world I live in. And that's how I see the world in how I operate. So I want to just build some context. So mobile phones, if you think about two events that really started formalizing data in Africa, and if you go back to this image, we think of this as a market, there's a lot of people, but that's actually data, right? It's just data in this very raw format, right? Which is very real. So the 2 events that really started kind of crystallizing this thing of, what does data look like on the continent is 1986, when it's actually reported that the first mobile phone call was made, right? There are different dates, there's arguments is 1991, 1992, 1986, but let's actually go back as far as 1986. So if you think about it, it started consolidating information around communication. So then in 2007 is when you started seeing a growth in mobile money. So transactions, peer-to-peer transactions, then peer-to-business transactions. So what you're seeing here is more of a commerce graph started emerging, right? So you're seeing a lot of data, but that data is now becoming more formalized and more structured in some sense, right? And this is where I enter. So as I mentioned to you, 2007 was the advent of mobile money. And into about 2010 at MIT, and I'll just give you some history of why I ended up here today and why and how I see data and how I see that actually driving growth on the continent is, I was an MIT student at MIT and really doing my PhD, focusing on different communities around the world, specifically in emerging markets, and trying to understand these communities. But I just didn't have data, right? And the most relevant data I had was 7 years old. And that data was actually from one of these big organizations, development organizations' website. So that I had that epiphany moment and say, wow, okay, this is a continent that's growing really rapidly. And the most recent data that anyone can access to make decisions around consumers and businesses and organizations was 7 years old. And I actually switched my whole PhD research to focus on this problem. So there was no SurveyMonkey, there was no Google Forms, there was no Medallia, there's no Qualtrics, there's nothing to actually capture that data. So you still had enumerators going out, asking questions, but that was very, very contained. It wasn't scalable. So developed a product to do that, which was a survey engine to capture data, first-party data from consumers answering text message. And that evolved into Ajua, which was actually a rebrand of mSurvey, because we were starting to do more than just collecting that one-party data. We started stitching other data sources together, which is second-party data and third-party data, based on the type of customers that we needed to solve this problem for. So there's a lot of businesses across Africa that just didn't have that kind of data that we're providing. So then we started stitching first-party, second-party, and third-party data together to really create a holistic view of who the consumer was for these businesses, and started selling that as an enterprise SaaS business. So just to build some context there, already you're seeing how someone can make a business can actually grow and make money based on data. And then in 2020, 2021, there was this urge to say, okay, there's a huge population, the SMEs are growing, there's a growing population of SMEs trying to get online, and they don't have the resources to actually do so. So we said, how do we take the same concept around data, leverage that, and build software that's very simple to use and to help amplify these businesses online. So that was the whole spin out of when I actually started Tappi to do so. But the fundamental thread still exists of how do we use the advent of consumer data to drive business growth and understand consumers across Africa. So market in numbers, right? So if you look at the market in numbers, so if you think about, data, right? As you saw that picture before, it shows the market, right? But if you zoom in on individuals in that market, there's a lot of information that you can find, right? So still, you have 66% of the economy is informal, right? 920 million consumers. That's just on 1 billion consumers. So we like to call them the invisible consumer, right? And there's a lot of them that business is trying to reach, right? But if you look at that individual consumer, there's a lot of robust consumer data that maps to that invisible consumer. And what you're seeing here is actual data. This is not made up data. This is actual data that we captured when I was building my first startup. Is just saying what type of data that we can actually collect and understand consumers, right? So you see the basics, your demographic information when it comes to gender, age, wealth, right? Then you also see spending habits, right? So, how do they spend their pastime, right? So, and as you can see, there's a lot of information here that kind of identifies and gives you more clarity on the consumer, right? And also it kind of emulates the fact that this is a consumer that you can serve if you understand them better, right? Whether it's a female, what's the medical bills, there's a lot of solutions coming up now for loans and healthcare and tech and health tech. So as you can see, this actually drives those types of solutions if you really have a granular understanding of who the consumer is. But the point I'm trying to stress here is that all this data was actually captured just through a mobile phone, right? So if you think of the mobile phone in the simplest form, it's a very, very, very powerful device that helps you to structure information around consumers. And that consumer has that device every day. I remember when we were building Ajua, we did a survey and we asked someone, if we asked the population, what would they return to their house for if they forgot? And the number one answer was actually the mobile phone, because it's your lifeline. You communicate through it, you transact money transactions with your bank account. Everything is linked to this one device that is very rich in information that really helps you understand this whole social and commerce graph across Africa. So the question is, and I think going back to this whole concept of how does Africa leverage data to monetize and grow, right? And if you think about economic growth, if you think about, who has this data, it boils down to the consumer, right? And I want to stress the fact that, the data is not data if you don't have a source, right? And the source in this case is the consumer. And, if this is actually at Harvard Business Review in 2020, and if you see there, it just talks about, the amount of money one can actually make collecting and selling data about people is $200 billion. And that's just one company, right? So if you think about this whole concept of data, and there's a lot of money that's actually in this concept that could also drive this whole economic drivers of growth for Africa. But I want to just double click on that a bit more, right? Because, if you think about $200 billion as a business, what does that mean to the consumer, right? And I'll build in the context of this. So when we're building a JUA and survey, there were, these brands, whether it's Harvard, Mass General Hospital, University of Washington, University of California, San Francisco. These are all really prominent brands, right? But they didn't have access to data. And more importantly, they didn't have access to consumer and patient data. So what we did, we said, okay, great, we can give you that access to the data, right? However, we have to source that data from someone, and that someone's a consumer. So we really kind of remodeled the way how consumer plays a part in this data and monetization of that data. So here's, the business on one side, or the organization on one side, and then here's the consumer on the other side. This business wants something from that consumer. Instead of actually having enumerators go out and offer, tea and, wait for that data and, really just use that data to calculate what they need to do, we said, how does the consumer play a part in that ecosystem from an economic perspective? And we said, why don't we pay them? Why can't the consumer actually receive a payment for their data? This is access to their data. And they're giving you access to this because you want to know very, very intimate questions. Some questions were, how often do you have sex? Do you use protection, right? Very, very intimate, very private questions were being asked to these consumers. So at the end of the day, incentivize a consumer to participate in this activity, whereas the outcome is bigger, right? So for instance, it actually drove the policy of pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is actually, it suppresses the viral load for certain diseases, i.e. HIV, and then also different safer conception of HIV. And so different things that it really drove the policy and decision-making for development, right? So here's an organization that's trying to drive development. Here's a consumer who plays a part in that development ecosystem. However, there was an imbalance, right? Imbalance, whereas the consumer was playing a part, but their data was being accessed, but they weren't actually getting compensated for it. So we changed the model, and we distributed 10% of every consumer, or every cost, the cost that would use to actually get that data from the consumer, that consumer made about between 5 and 10% based on the granularity of that data. So this just shows you that there's a proof of consumers can actually play a part in this development and also earn from this, right? And it could be this whole system of participation to make sure that data is leveraged for growth. So let me just add a bit more context as far as size, right? So if you think about this as OECD, they actually, I think it's 2020, it's 35.1 billion that is assisted on the development side in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you think about this, I mean, I know this because, we've actually had to do this, and we were on the receiving end of some of these grants that some of the agencies needed to do research. There's a lot of money that is allotted to research and data collection. So we said, we asked the question. This is a question for today, and I encourage folks that were listening to actually think about this question because it's a necessary question, right? So there was a model that we proved that a consumer can play a role in this economic development, but more importantly, you're kind of cutting this in two ways, whereas the end result is a benefit, but there's an immediate return to that consumer, which is that money in their wallet immediately. So 31.1 billion, that's a lot of money, right? So think of a citizen owning their own, they're the custodian of their data, right? Whereas they can give you access when you require that access and you pay for that access, right? And it doesn't have to be development agencies. It could be brands, it could be the big Unilevers, the Coca-Colas, whatever the case may be. And that consumer can actually hedge that data and say, okay, I'll actually sell it to you at this cost or Y cost or N plus what cost, right? And there's a model for this already in Estonia, right? Estonia actually uses a citizen data, whereas a citizen is a custodian of their data, right? And anyone, it could be a hospital, it could be an organization, it could be a government organization that wants to access their data. They ask for access from the citizen, and the citizen actually opens up access to that data to that organization. So as you can see, if you can actually even just iterate on that model and say, okay, great, access, but how does someone pay for that access? This consumer can actually play a part and play a role in this economic development. So I'm going to switch gears a bit. And, I spoke about how the consumer can leverage and, use data and play a role for growth, right? I mean, that goes into the consumer's wallet, and they can play a role in that as well. Let's actually switch gears to on the business side. So, the problem with data, there's a lot of it, right? And it comes in different forms. It comes in, as you guys know, the mobile phone is very rich with data, from text to images to voice to sound. I mean, there's a lot of information that's shared on a mobile phone, right? So the problem with that is that it's a lot of data. Now, how do you kind of organize it in the sense of Africa? Whereas, there's a growing ownership of mobile phones. There's a lot of devices that's actually tethered to the internet. There's a lot of information that's being shared, whether it's on social media, whether it's on WhatsApp, there's a lot of information being shared. So how do you kind of understand that flow of information to kind of consolidate it and structure it to make sense? And this is where I think the money lies when it comes to that growth trajectory and an economic input for businesses on the continent, and how they can actually grow using data in an organized way, right? So what you're seeing is actual data from 2019 that we also collected. And this is actually, they call it longitudinal data. So you measure someone's wallet over time, right? So what is that person spending every day and every month on goods and services? And as you can see here, there's different things that these consumers spend on, whether it's food, household wear, betting, bills, non-alcoholic beverages, alcohol, airtime, and transport. And one of very interesting things we found in this data is that, a lot of consumers, they have a constrained wallet across the continent. And what I mean by the choices that they have to make every month, right, is that am I going to use this or this, right? And they swap those choices. But the business that understand those choices are actually the ones that are going to win, right? If you understand and index really on those choices, you know exactly how the consumer behaves, and you know that your brand can actually be the winning brand for these businesses. So a case in point, we in this data set, we realize that typically you think brands in the same industry compete against each other, but in this case, it wasn't the case. You had brands that are totally doing different things actually competing. For instance, in insurance is competing with a mobile operator. You have a mobile operator competing with a consumer brand, because they're trying to focus on capturing that consumer's attention, right? So the business that actually organizes this data actually won, because they know exactly how that consumer behave over time, and really looking at the ways that they could actually be the winning brand in that consumer's life. So organizing this data, what we did was making sure we monetize it for ourselves, and also the businesses that want to use the data to win with their selling their product or services. So the reason why this is important is this whole decision support and decision making, right? Before we started this, a lot of businesses and organizations across the continent, they were actually, for them, they were doing a lot of guesswork, right? We talk about the gut feel and intuition, and we call them undocumented experiences, where someone who just says, they have the greatest experience, I've seen this before, but there's no information to share about this experience. And obviously, you go down that path, and it results in a nightmare. Same thing, we call it the hippo, right? The highest paid person's opinion, right? Someone who influences the decision making, but has no data or no information to kind of influence that decision. And obviously it goes down this very, very not so great path. So we really want to change that. We really try to change that across the continent. And we believe there's a need to change that because the more information you have on the consumers, which is 1.4 billion, that could really change the trajectory of the continent, right? I mean, as you know the numbers, right? 70% under the age of 31. There's a growing population, 1.4 billion. It's just massive, right? Some people forget that Nigeria is 65% the size of the US, right? Really, really huge markets, right? But a lot of this decision making is actually made ad hoc, and that's why things fail, right? So really trying to put that, connecting that consumer to the business and how they actually make decisions to drive their business growth and also monetize on that data. So here's a case, and I think this is my last slide, but here's a case of an actual business. This is an actual business in Africa, and it was a restaurant business. It was one of our customers, and a simple review from a customer changed the trajectory of that business. And they actually made $200,000 in new revenue from a single review. And the story is that, and the data shows, is that there's one customer in a certain region that gave feedback on certain things on the menu. And that customer wanted some local dishes on the menu. So what they did was use our data to traverse that customer information and traverse to see how many more customers look like that customer and look at the market opportunity and say, okay, great. If we did this, what would that actually evolve into, or what would that result look like? So sure enough, they did it, and they actually revised the menu, and that was an additional $200,000 of new revenue for that customer. So it just shows you, what simple data, or in an organized way, and how it can actually drive business growth across the continent. And today, really what we want to do as we build Tappi is really just, build the intelligence behind these small businesses to really help them win. When we think about winning on the internet, it really requires some rigor in the back end and traversing a lot of data. And as you can see, what's going on with AI, with ChatGPT and everything else, this data informs information, information informs decisions. And we know that small businesses, if they don't show up online with the proper data sets around them today, they're going to miss out on the $180 billion economy in Africa. And for us, we think that this is the new data in Africa. And, for us, we want to really change that and making sure that we're using as leverage to drive growth across the continent. So I'll just pause there. I'm happy to take questions, and I hope this, triggered some thought processes and some new information that you can use, whether it's immediately or in the future. And I really appreciate this opportunity to discuss, something that I'm passionate about on the continent. And I'll just take a pause there.
Well, thank you so much. We can stop sharing the presentation for now. Well, thank you for all of this this kind of set of insights that you were able to provide us with. I really love the example that you gave regarding businesses that can monetize organized data, that restaurant that was able to make an extra $200,000 just based on actionable data. And what you're doing really well is that you're trying to identify insights that can lead to decisions that are actually based on real data. But I want to take it back to when I first met you, when we were both MIT students back in 2011. And this is before you were Dr. Griffith. You were just a student. You were not yet Dr. Griffith. And you were already kind of thinking of how data could be turned into actionable insights for businesses and governments. And obviously, M-Survey spun out of research that you were doing while a student at MIT. But my question actually relates to an approach that I was actually exposed to around the same time you and I were having those early conversations. And this time I'm really speaking from the point of view of a witness. And this was the work that I was doing with Sandy Pentland and Joost Bonson at the MIT Media Lab. And this is when Sandy was working on his book, which became very influential, Social Physics. And Sandy was talking about two very different approaches to data collection. He was talking about small groups, like you could even call that focus groups that lead to certain specific kinds of data, but also very large groups, such as entire cities. So my question to you is, what is the difference in approach with respect to data analysis when you're studying a very small group, such as perhaps the one that is related to the example you gave for the restaurant, and very, very large groups, such as perhaps the work that you've done with large telcos, such as MTN, when you're dealing with entire huge data sets for an entire country's population?
That's a good question. I think obviously, when you look at data, you're trying to answer a question, right? You're really trying to figure out exactly, and when you think of a consumer and consumers, in Sandy's, because I used to follow Sandy's work, they're looking at behavioral patterns, right? How do communities, how do groups of people behave, right? And I think for us, it's looking at similarities and data points. You're trying to create a graph of what connects these people, right? And as you look at smaller groups, you can say, okay, it's just like communities, right? Or we like to call them like tribes, right? You can say, okay, is there tribal effect here between these smaller groups? Whereas larger groups, and I can give you an example of this, we were the first ones to do. We did a large survey across Trinidad and Tobago, the first mobile survey that was done across the whole population for the government. And what they're trying to do is looking at actual access to digital tools, right? Which was a conundrum because you're using a mobile phone to actually look at access to digital tools, which also gave you an indicator of who had access and who didn't, right? But that gave you it really helped us looked at metrics and indices of access across a whole population, right? Across a whole country, whereas that's going to be used to make a policy decision, right? So, if you think about larger populations, think about, okay, what is the drivers there? In that case, in the example that I gave, it was a policy decision. In smaller groups, maybe you're trying to just understand, more of a product market fit, or more of like, how do certain people behave in certain environments, right? And you kind of contain that, right? But I think that's how I see larger groups and smaller groups when we think about data and data collection. I mean, and if I am to go a step further, the reason why we built this survey engine very early on is because there was nothing like it, right? I mean, people had a mobile phone, they didn't have access to the internet. The only thing that they had was voice. They didn't even have data. It was just voice and text, right? So we really had to figure out exactly how do we get inputs from that individual to understand that individual at the end of that phone. And then once we had enough information, then we can say, okay, what is the similarities in different small groups and then in wider groups, right? But it just gives you more leverage to understand individuals as well, but also in the larger context, right? Because as you can see, the world is going now. It's like everyone wants to be individualized, right? They want to be themselves, right? They don't want to be grouped, So I think now, it's even going further down where you have huge populations, smaller groups, and now everyone wants to be an individual, that you have to understand that individual for who they are and how you actually relate to that individual.
This is really interesting because when we were thinking of this session, we really wanted to, in the conversations we had, Michelle, Ari, and I, think of a webinar session that would be really useful to students who are looking to become founders and to create new businesses. And this is exactly what you did. And I remember speaking with you shortly after you signed the agreement with MTN, and you were looking to drive SaaS adoption for all kinds of small and medium-sized businesses across Nigeria. And for those who don't know, MTN is the dominant telco in many parts of Africa. And you obviously were operating in the largest of the MTN markets, in the Nigerian market, the largest of all African markets. And I want to ask you what some of your learnings were from that experience dealing with such large data sets that are so crucial to the everyday life of the people of a specific population.
That's a great question. I think, let me see how I answer that. I think because of this, I think MIT kind of trained you to think big. It's just, we don't want to solve small problems. We want to we're crazy, right? I mean, I was a GRT graduate resident too at MIT, and I was doing my PhD, and you have these undergrads coming to you and they want to do what? I'm like, wow, you just started, right? So conditioned to think big, is when we started out and say, okay, if you think of how I started M-Survey, I looked at how do you think of actually touching the lives of consumers at scale, right? So starting from that principle is how do you do that from a mechanical and technical perspective, right? So very early on, I said, okay, we cannot actually do this ourselves. And when I say ourselves, in the sense that we have to integrate with someone who's connecting to large bodies of data, more importantly, large sets of consumers. So we had to learn the ropes of connecting to large data sets, right? So just hiring the right people, hiring some really smart folks from MIT as well to help us solve that problem. But knowing that telcos are massive, I won't call them hoarders of data, but they have a lot of data on consumers across the continent, right? So you have to be prepared to think of that and be ready to know that you're trying to take data set from all over, right? Whether it's mobile money, whether it's a call, whether it's a text, whether it's an image someone sends, you have to be ready to think about that, right? And it's just setting challenges for us as a startup, right? I mean, we know that Nigeria is the biggest market, MTN is the biggest mobile operator, and just building infrastructure for that problem is how we attack it, right? And, and for us is making sure that we have the right infrastructure. The thing that I learned building enterprise SaaS for over 10 years is we had to serve big banks as well, right? With 20 million plus customers, right? We were actually embedded into their their banking core systems. So if someone makes a transaction at the bank, we were actually integrated into that transaction. So we're capturing that information so we can ask that customer questions on behalf of that bank, right? So, talk about throughput, go from 10 transactions per second to 100 transactions per second to 2,000 transactions per second. You constantly had to push the boundaries to make sure that you are actually reaching that consumer where they are and when it's most convenient for them. So that's the mindset that we went into that partnership with MTN, because we had that rigor from before, because we built enterprise SaaS for both banks, which are large in large economies across Africa, and also we integrated mobile operators to manage they call it the SMS traffic. So we're able to kind of think in large numbers and large data set as we partner with MTN. And I hope that answered your question.
It does, because it leads me to the next question as I move from the business sector to the real development issues that we're focused on with this webinar series, which we've been branding sustainable development to stay consistent with the SDGs. And as I said earlier, only 20% of SDG indicators currently have data available, which is a huge problem. So with the kind of data analysis that you've been able to kind of drive, and the very kind of harmonized data that you've been able to push through your platforms, can you tell me about how perhaps you can use this methodology to solve major public health issues? And maybe we could just use COVID as an example, because it was such a scary situation in Africa. So we didn't really know how many people, how to track people, how to identify people. So let's just use one example that might be helpful from a development perspective.
No, that's a great question. Data is the driver of development, right? If you don't have data, it's a core of understanding what problem you're trying to solve. And if you have no data, you're not developing anything, right? You can think you're developing something, but you're not developing anything, right? And typically, the populations that we're trying to address, that we're trying to reach, they have very limited information about them. So having tools to really kind of consolidate this information is a benefit for development goals, right? And if you think about it in the health, right? I gave you 3 examples that we actually did. We were the ones who helped launch pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is actually a drug to suppress HIV/AIDS, right? Which obviously, lengthens lifestyle and changes the whole demographic of society, right? And then also, we think about and specifically to COVID, something that we realized, and you guys probably went through so many of these questionnaires. There's a simple questionnaire that everyone gave you to understand if you had COVID or not, right? Very simple questionnaire that says, okay, do you have a fever? Were you around someone in the last 14 days that had a fever? Blah, 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 right? A lot of that information could be collected over time and also is mapped to you as a consumer, right? So, and if you think about location-based information, right? If you're actually capturing this data at scale and you're asking people these questions and you're seeing a pattern in certain areas to say, hey, it seems like a lot of people are actually affected by fever in this area because you're seeing that as a result of the questionnaire, that leads you to kind of guide where you actually should place your resources and your money, right? And I think for us is, the way and just to take you back, we actually started as an NGO. We actually started as a .org. That's where msurvey actually had the domain msurvey.org. But we wanted to be more than that, right? We wanted to be more than that. We wanted to actually drive more sustainable results for the businesses that we serve and the organizations that we serve. And we also had to think about a business, ourselves as a business, because it's not for us. We can rely on grant funding to now serve folks who rely on grant funding, right? We had to actually be a business to actually provide the tools and data to help these development agencies win, right? But I think data, for us is the drivers of development, right? I mean, that's the core of any community that you're trying to understand is, you're trying to understand their problem and you're trying to fix their problem, right? And at the end of the day, if you don't understand their problem, you don't know what to fix. And the only thing that's going to guide you in understanding the problems is sufficient information and data around these consumers.
Ingrid Nystrom is asking a question, which is based on what she sees as a contradiction between people owning their own data and actually getting the data from mobile companies such as MTN that I mentioned. Do you see a contradiction in the way that she does?
Actually, I love that question. That's a great question, right? And I also want to just a caveat to that, and just to be clear on that, is that every data point we collect is consent, right? Every data point. So every consumer, so at the end of it, even though we're connected to telcos, we actually ask for consent from the consumer with any question we ask them or any information we're using about that, right? So most of the data that you've seen in this case is actually self-reported data or data that they've consented us to actually accept, right? So, and that's why I come back to the fact of, when you think of consumer owning their data, right? We really looked at that lens, right? Because we're saying this consumer owns their data. How do we ask them for permission to use that data? And go beyond from just permission. How do we actually pay them to actually use their data and design a business model around that? Because now you're aligning incentives, right? To say, okay, great. If you are a brand and you're trying to understand me better to now market to me, why don't you pay me to market to me, right? And I think for us, it's really kind of leveling the playing field to some extent, whereas these consumers can play part in the being custodians of their data. So just to really just talk, just to drive that point home, is that we never actually worked on data outside of purview of the consumer. The consumer always knew that they were reporting that data to us.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense. I don't know if she'll be satisfied with that answer, but it seems pretty convincing to me. Let me ask Kyle Marston's question, which is about the benchmarks, right? 1986 being the first mobile phones, 2007 being, well, I guess probably M-Pesa and mobile banking becoming a reality. And Kyle wants to know what you see as the next significant benchmark, or we could even call that a milestone for
Wow,
Africa with respect to data.
that's a great
That's a tough one,
question.
right?
That's a
It's a
tough
really
one.
tough one.
That's a really tough one. I think let me put it this way. It's like, the internet was not built for Africa, right? And I say that in a very strong tone, whereas, it's the way how people access the internet is totally different from how we assumed that they would now in Africa, right? And, if you think about, mobile telephones, 1986, you think of mobile money, which kind of consolidated this transaction, started to create the commerce graph. What is that point in time, whereas the way how people access the internet is going to really even kind of reposition how data is actually collected and stored and also structured, right? Case in point, and this is the problem that we really try to attack is, I can't have this conversation without ChatGPT. I don't know why, but if you go on ChatGPT and you search for information, it tells you, okay, the last information I have was 2021, and the information I have was based on the internet information, images, books, and whatever. The point is, if you're not on the internet with the right data sets and the structure of information around you, you're non-existent in the world. That's going to be the future, right? Whereas, people are starting to search differently. People are starting to look for information differently, whereas you're seeing a different types of web, right? You think about, historically, Google was all about search, and then search actually turned into commerce, because if you look at Google today, people are just searching for some commercial activity, right? Whereas now in this whole new search event, people are actually looking for information, right? People are looking for structured information so they can actually sound really intelligent at a wine party, right? but just get little snippets of information. But I see that could also be pivotal as far as how are we collecting information? How is that information structured for the view of consumers in the future, right? Because there's so many things happening around financial services right now, whereas financial services, when it's very digital, right? Very real time, captured information moving back and forth. And there's a lot of information tied to that, right? Whether you think about how people are providing loans, healthcare, ag tech, there's a lot of information around that, right? But how do you structure that information, and how do you play a part, or we play a part on the continent in the internet economy? And that's just, I don't know if it's going to be an event, but it's something that we should think about as we start thinking more about how data is being captured on the continent.
Thank you. Awad Abdel Halim from Sudan will actually now take the mic and ask his questions. Please introduce yourself first, Awad. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude, and thanks, Kenfield. This is a great presentation, really amazing work. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here with the Urban Mobility and Transit Labs at MIT, and as Claude mentioned, I'm from Sudan originally. And my entry to working with data in Africa particularly was trying to conduct some work in Sudan, similar to what you were mentioning, and you just don't find data. So in our domain of work, we started collecting data on mobility and urban mobility and public transportation. And I think my question to you around that is, as you mentioned around here, whether it's at MIT or just, places where the internet was built for in general, people understand the value of data. It's ubiquitous, right? I mean, in America here every day, if you think about sports stats, think about Moneyball, right? Stock markets, even like electoral college and voting, all of that, people are used to the value of data. So maybe my first question is, when you're giving that value proposition, whether it's for the consumers that this will make your life better, or to the businesses that you really need this to drive that growth and get that extra 200,000 that you weren't going to get, which one did you find more challenging to engage? Was it the consumers to kind of engage with the data and understanding that it can improve the quality of the service they get, or is it the businesses to make those data-informed decisions?
That's a good question. Let me go back in time. So, and this is just my journey, and I just actually build it in context of my journey. So when we're building Survey, which actually rebranded as a JUA, we we didn't have, I wouldn't say we had a lot of challenge convincing consumers, because we attached an incentive. We said, hey, if you answer these questions, we're going to immediately send money to your phone, right? And the questions were very, what's your, how old are you? What's your gender? Blah, blah, blah. And obviously some people were a bit, you have your early adopters and you have folks who are like, oh, this is not bad, I can just do it, right? And I think that was, for us, an easier sell, right? Because, they saw the value in it, that they were getting something incentivized to do something. But also they, as you started speaking to them, they realized, wait, actually, these are the same questions that someone will sit in front of me and ask me. Right. So I know that same person said that they're going to use my data to do something, right? Whether it's, their project, right? So now they connected both and say, wait, I can actually get an incentive, and it still also drives the outcome of the project to even help me. So it's like that double whammy, right? Then, we realized that I think there was a huge challenge in the beginning for really the businesses knew they needed data, right? But they had, they had the behavior, they had the way of doing business, right? So it's actually trying to change that behavior was the biggest part. But one thing we did very early on was actually show the value of the data in real time. So what we built was a huge audience of consumers that would just respond to questions in real time. So we'll go to a business and we say, hey, ask any question you want, right? We type in that question, we send it out to the audience, and in real time, they will see that live data, and they look at you and say, okay, is this real? Like, yes, it's real. This is the real consumers, and this is the demographic data attached. And that was the whole convincing when they actually saw it tangible. And then they started changing the direction and say, wow, because you're coming from a place where, they didn't have something like this, right? So they couldn't imagine what something like this would look like until you showed it to them. And they realized, I can't go back to what I was doing before because this thing existed, right? So I think for us, we kind of had to show it to them and show it to them with live data, and I mean, I remember those days, they're like, wait, and they actually, some of these very executives, they would ask to be on these audiences. It's like, can I be on this audience to actually give you feedback as well, right? Because, you got an incentive. So I think that was my whole learning and the journey of this, of building this whole data infrastructure for businesses across Africa.
Okay, this is great. And then just a shorter question, just in the interest of time. You did touch on this, I think, in Ingrid's question. Like you mentioned, the businesses, once they see the value, which translates to them into profit, it's great, you made the case. How do you get the naysayers on the consumer side, so the people who are not engaged with you? Is there any particular recommendation that you'd give to build trust and have those people opt into the system?
I think so.
You can answer that in 1 minute or less.
Yeah.
Answer in 1 minute or less.
1 minute. The thing is trust, right? And once people around them started using it, they trusted it. And I think trust is the actual, it's a currency of commerce in Africa, right? And you just have to learn how to navigate that. And trust was the biggest thing that we had to build.
Thank you, Awad. Thank you, Kenfield, or Dr. Griffith, I should say. Please share with us 3 books that you would recommend to this audience. It's always how we wrap these webinars, when we have time for them. All right. You want to speak to them really quickly?
So I recommend these 3 books, and I'll tell you why. Thanks, Claude, for making me think about that. I had to put a list together. So How Google Works, and Competing Against Luck, and The $1 Trillion Coach. Obviously, as you guys know, Google's vision is to really organize the world's data, right, and information. And I felt like it was very interesting because, as you can know, that's something I'm passionate about, and wanted to know exactly how Google is thinking about the same problem as you look at building, a data company in Africa. And then 2, Competing Against Luck, which is Clayton Christensen, that's from Harvard, the late Clayton Christensen. it's all about understanding the customer. And this is, I think this is a book that I highly recommend for anyone who's actually starting a business or actually doing research around consumers. And it all talks about the job to be done theory, right? So what job are you doing for your customer that they will pay you for? And I think it was great. I had my whole team read it, and they were, everyone was around talking about the jobs to be done theory. It was very interesting, right? And then last but not least, the $1 trillion coach. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a second-time entrepreneur, and for me is, sometimes, you think about yourself as this journey that you're taking, and it could be very lonely. And you think about the Bill Gates, you think about Eric Schmidt, you think about Jeff Bezos, and you're like Steve Jobs. Man, these are superheroes, right? And they have superpowers, but realizing that there's actually people around them that make them superheroes, right? And one of the things that they really invested in was coaching. And this $1 trillion coach just talks about the power of coaching and how this one man, Bill Campbell, was actually one of the biggest drivers for $1 trillion businesses across Silicon Valley. And it also helped me to understand how important coaching is in my career and my journey as an entrepreneur. So I definitely recommend these books. I have many more, but I think these are good books based on your journey and your career. If you're looking to also be an entrepreneur.
Thank you so much, Kenfield Griffith, for this fantastic session. We learned so much. And next week, we will have a session, which will be our final session for this year's webinar series. And it'll be on May 18th. It's supposed to be at 12 p.m., but we might change the time depending on Dr. Obi Ezekwesili's calendar. And the session will be about what Africa's future leaders can do to transform the continent. Obi Ezekwesili is the former Minister of Education in Nigeria, former presidential candidate in Nigeria, and also the founder of the Bring Back Our Girls movement that Michelle Obama endorsed, and that is really important in Nigeria and all over Africa. Thank you for tuning in. See you next week.